Welcome to Lesson 7.1, Managing Security Operations Privileged Account. In your Candidate Information Bulletin, we are in the Security Operations domain, and we are in Key Area of Knowledge C, which is Understand and Apply Foundational Security Concepts. Our topics are going to include Security Operations Personnel as Custodians, Privileged Account Management, including Access Control and Monitoring, Least Privilege, Separation of Duties, Job Rotation, Mandatory Vacations, and Third-Party Oversight. Our security operations and IT administrative personnel are often data or system custodians. Now, to remind you, custodians are responsible for implementing policy and standards, managing systems, monitoring for compliance, and reporting and responding to security violations, incidents, and breaches. Custodians generally have very specialized either information technology or security-related skills. Because of the work they do, custodians are generally assigned administrative or equivalent rights and permissions. And it's really important to maintain control over a privileged account, including the number, the type, and the use of privileged accounts related to network, operating systems, applications, databases, or devices. Privileged accounts generally have full, unrestricted access and control, essentially the keys to the kingdom. Exploits generally execute in the security context of the user. So our privileged accounts should never be used for user activity such as web browsing and email. We want to make sure that our custodians have two types of accounts, that they have their custodian or privileged accounts when they need to do those type of functions, and they have user accounts when they're doing their normal day-to-day activities, such as web browsing or email. In addition to privileged account assignments, there are default privileged accounts in our operating systems and our applications. Our root and built-in administrator account is generally the all-powerful default administrative account. If possible, we want to have that account be renamed. And we did discuss earlier one of the challenges with that, particularly in the Windows environment, that even if you rename the account, the security identifier or SID still remains intact. But if possible, we do want to rename that account, and we don't want to use that account. We should be instead assigning privileges. We should never allow multiple users to use that administrative account because we have a total loss of accountability when it's shared among users. The default passwords for administrative accounts should always be changed. Matter of fact, if you go out to the internet, you can bring down a list of default privileged account names and default passwords for almost every device, operating system, application, and database in existence. We always want to log all activity that's associated with an administrative account. And if somebody is coming in using that account, we want to make sure that remote access is always multi-factor. That we should never allow, particularly from a remote access perspective, a privileged account to be associated with just a password. We know that passwords are inherently insecure. The second type of default privileged accounts we have are service accounts. These usually are privileged accounts that are used by services or applications. We want to make sure that if we're doing that, the passwords are complex, that we have an in-place strategy for changing passwords over time, and that service account activity should be logged. And lastly, we have applications or database administrative accounts. Those are used for management and maintenance. Just like our other assigned accounts, they should be separate from a normal user account, and activities should be logged. So one of the common themes that you should have picked up from this screen is this idea of logging, that our root or built-in administrative accounts, our service accounts, our applications or database accounts, all their activities should be logged, it should be inspected, reviewed, and analyzed. Elevated privileges, when we're assigning them to custodians, should be assigned whenever possible to roles and not to individuals. In a role-based access control environment, RBAC, our roles are defined by task or by job function, and then users are assigned a role that corresponds to the rights and privileges they need to do their job. Whenever possible, users should be assigned a single privilege role to prevent aggregation and to streamline termination. Remember, aggregation is excess rights and permissions, or rights and permissions that are inconsistent with a role or function. Now, you can only implement RBAC if your application or operating system supports RBAC. In a DAC environment, discretionary access control environment, you're not going to have these same options. In a DAC environment, you should be creating security equivalent accounts. Rights and permissions should be assigned to our custodians based on the principles of least privilege and separation of duties. There's no reason to ever assign to anyone, a user or a custodian, any more rights or privileges than they need to accomplish their task. We also may want to consider separation of duties to ensure that we don't have any collusion going on in our organization. Least privilege means granting the account only the access and privileges they need to perform their job. You've seen this come up before, and I guarantee it'll come up on the exam. You want to be aware of inclusive default settings. Those would be settings that have way too many rights and permissions than necessary. Separation of duties isolates tasks to prevent collusion, but also to prevent fraud, mistakes, and violation to change control. If you have a change control process that requires multiple approvals, we know that no one person could make a change, either accidental, willful, or malicious, that could be harmful. So, for example, separating the tasks of approving a firewall rule change and implementing a rule change. That would be a really good example of separation of duties. Now, sometimes our custodians might be third parties, or we may have to give our third parties some privileged access because they're coming in to do some support of a device, an application, an operating system. So third parties, whether they're vendors, subcontractors, consultants, may need to be provided access on an as-needed basis. For accountability, third-party accounts should not be shared. So for example, perhaps we have an outsourced IT team. We're not going to give them just one account to use no matter who's coming in. Every individual that may have a reason to come in remotely or even be on site should have a unique account so that we can tie back all activity to that subject. The principle of least privilege should be applied, and by default, third-party privileges should be disabled and then enabled only when required. Third parties with privileged access, just like our custodians, their activities should be monitored, logged, and reviewed. Privileged account reviews should be conducted on a regular basis. We want to be ensuring, 1, that the user is still an employee or that the third party is still viable. 2, that the assignment is still appropriate. That the user is not on leave or on vacation, that it should be still enabled. And that our third-party accounts have defaulted back to disable mode. So if, in fact, a third party came in, we enabled their account for them to use it, we want to make sure that that account has then been disabled and it remains disabled until the next time they need to use the account. Privileged account activity should be logged and should be reviewed daily. The log should also be sent to a system that the privileged account does not have privileges to. We want to ensure that if we had a malicious user, they can't get to those logs and they can't manipulate those logs, or worse, delete them. Any activity that's done by a privileged account should be compared to change or configuration management requests. An alert should be set up for high-impact activity, such as a firewall rule set change or a remote login, so that we know that that activity is happening. Other concepts to consider are job rotation and mandatory vacations. Job rotations can uncover policy violations, abnormal procedures, mistakes, fraud, or intentional harm. And a secondary benefit of job rotation is cross-training and skills diversity. Mandatory vacations of a specified consecutive day period, so you can't just take one day, you have to take a week or 2 weeks, can provide similar benefits to job rotation and in addition may act as a deterrent to malicious or unwanted behavior. Remote access should also be disabled during a mandatory vacation. If we're going to allow our privileged account or custodian to still have remote access, then really the whole benefit of mandatory vacations has gone out the window. So that brings us to our Lesson 7.1 review. We started with talking about security operations personnel as custodians and that they usually have privileged accounts, and that privileged account management includes access controls and monitoring. We reviewed the concept of least privilege, not having any more privileges necessary to do your task. We looked at the concept of separation of duties, where no one person is control of an entire process. We looked at the benefits of job rotation and mandatory vacations to uncover fraud, wrongdoing, collusion, and the side benefit of having cross-trained personnel. And then lastly, we looked at third-party oversight, that whenever we have third parties that have privileged access that they act as custodians, we need to have oversight, we need to be managing and monitoring them, we need to be logging their activity, and if the third party is not on site all the time, so they're there occasionally or they come in remotely, that their account should be disabled by default and only enabled when they're on site or have been granted permissions to do remote access. So our Lesson 7.1 match the meaning terms are RBAC, aggregation, root, least privilege, separation of duties, custodian, security context, and service account. So I'd like you to take a few minutes, look at the terms on the left, match them up with the terms on the right, put me on pause. When you're ready, come on back and we'll do them together. Let's go through our Lesson 7.1 terms. RBAC, that's role-based access control. That's when we're assigning rights and permissions to roles. Aggregation is an excess or inconsistent privileges or rights or permissions for a particular role. A root is a built-in admin account or a built-in administrator account. Least privilege is the principle of assigning only what is needed. Separation of duties, task isolation, meaning that no one person or one subject is in control of an entire process. A custodian is someone who manages and monitors systems. Security context is the security attributes that are in effect. We use that as talking about that generally an attacker will execute in the security context of the currently logged in user. And lastly, a service account is an account that's used primarily by applications. I hope you did great on this. So we're going to end as always with our CISSP exam tips. Privileged accounts should never be used for user activity such as web browsing and email. By default, third-party privileged accounts should be disabled and enabled only when required. And lastly, a reminder that aggregation is excess rights and permissions. So thanks for joining me for this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next.